It's a tough environment. It's been particularly tough environment, obviously, for the hobbyist community, which are really at the heart of what we do at Raspberry Pi. I think the good news is you look at what we've tried to build at the foundation in terms of infrastructure, is to build the organizational infrastructure, the social infrastructure that you require in order to have a good experience with computing. So, what did the social infrastructure look like for me as a child? Teachers who'd respond to me hacking the school network by giving me an account on my own private account rather than sending me to the headmaster and putting me in detention, right? People who would engage with well-intentioned but some potentially disruptive enthusiasm in a positive rather than a negative way.
Hey everyone, it's David Bombal back with a very, very special guest. Eben, welcome.
Good to be here.
I want to talk about the whole history, about how this stuff came about, from your ideas to reality. But before we get there, I think a pressing question a lot of people will have is, I can't buy it.
Yeah, we're in this very, very strange time. We are still in the aftermath of the pandemic. I guess an interesting thing happened about 3 years. Well, obviously an interesting thing happened 3 years ago. But from the point of view of people who want to build electronic products, the interesting thing that happened in the spring of 2020 was that there was an assumption that the pandemic was going to lead to a worldwide recession, a major worldwide recession. That led to electronic product manufacturers and manufacturers of electronic components deciding to run their inventory down. The last thing you want to be stuck with in a recession is a big part of unsold product. And so there was a period of time, probably 3 to 6 months, where people were destocking, were running down their inventories. And at the same time that was happening, the recession that people were predicting wasn't arriving. And the reason for that, obviously, was governments took kind of furlough type action to support the income of people who weren't able to work because of the pandemic.
Yeah.
And so you're in an environment where you have some people who are stuck at home with nothing to do because they're on furlough. You have some people who are at home and have work to do, or at home and need to study from home. And all of those people are more, not less, inclined to buy electronic products. And it took a little while for all of us who make electronics to realize this and to adjust our purchasing behavior accordingly. And so probably by the time you get to the autumn of 2020, you're in an environment where everyone's run their inventory down, and suddenly everyone wakes up one day and says, I don't have enough stuff. I'd better go order some more chips.
Yeah.
In the first instance, that leads to a fairly small shortage environment. Lead times start to go out. But as we saw, I guess a little earlier with toilet paper and hand sanitizer, once there's a perception of shortage, people change their buying behavior, and so you get these kind of panic dynamics. You get people trying to build inventory. And we've seen now a 2.5 year period where it's been hard to get your hands on electronic components on any kind of sensible lead time at any kind of sensible price. That's affected Raspberry Pi. It's affected a lot of people. You see these pictures from Germany of these enormous car parks outside car factories full of cars that have no engine. These stories about people having one engine management computer, and you put it in your Volkswagen, you drive it out into the parking lot, you take the engine management computer out and you put it in the next one and you drive that out, and then you start to stockpile almost finished cars. This has been affecting a lot of people, and it's affected Raspberry Pi. The interesting thing about Raspberry Pi we've been selling them for a little over 11 years now, and for most of that time, the model we've had for getting your hands on Raspberry Pi is probably maybe 500,000 Raspberry Pis out there in channel at any given time. And whether you're an individual who wants to buy a single unit, or an industrial customer who wakes up one day and needs 10,000, 20,000, 50,000 for a product, you can pull that from channel without really disturbing the inventory that's out there. We've gone from that world to a world where, they are in shortage, where we're having, where hobbyists are having to join queues, either having to look monitor very closely to see inventory going out into the channel or join queues at resellers. You're seeing a world where for our industrial customers, we're having to do what we call active management, actually, rather than just having them be available in the wild. We're actually having to kind of get in touch with our customers. It's a kind of novel idea. We're actively managing relationships now with about 2,500 OEM customers who embed Raspberry Pis into their products. And we have a team here who are constantly on the phone to these guys saying, what do you need? Don't let us be the guy who stops you from being able to build your own product. How many do you need to keep going today? Not how many do you need so you can build a buffer, so you can feel comfortable, but how many do you need so that your factory does not stop producing today? So it's a tough environment. It's been particularly tough environment, obviously, for the hobbyist community, which are really at the heart of what we do at Raspberry Pi. I think the good news is this is the quarter where we turn the corner. I've got my numbers for Q2 this year. We had a fairly lean Q1. So Q1, January, February, March this year, we did under 1 million units of Raspberry Pi. That's probably the the slowest quarter that we've had since 2015. I think the last time we had a quarter that low was 2015. Q2 though this year we're going to be in the region of 2 million units. It's an annualized rate of 8 million units. That would make it the best or second best quarter that we've ever done. And then from Q3 onwards this year, effectively we are unconstrained. So we have upwards of 3 million units of inbound silicon in Q3 this year, more than that in Q4. This is the first quarter that's a really good pre-pandemic quarter. We have backlogs to fill. So I think there will still be a period of time where you'll see, if you're an industrial customer, you'll see this active management business. You'll see us calling you up and trying to manage your demand and prevent stockpiling. If you're a hobbyist, I expect what you'll be exposed to is single unit orders, these kind of anti-scalping measures, right? Yeah. And you'll probably see that through into Q3. So I think you'll probably, by the time you get into Q3, you'll be in a position where if you want a single unit as of any product as an enthusiast, I think you'll be able to get one. And then probably by the time you get into Q4, you'll be kind of getting back into that kind of heavy inventory world where really you can have whatever you want as quickly as you want.
So, I mean, we're recording this in April 2023. April, May, June is when things start getting a bit better. But the July is when it's hopefully back to old days, right?
Yeah, back to the old days, but with kind of still expect a quarter of single unit limits. Right?
Yeah. But I can get a bunch for Christmas.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a reasonable expectation. If you go and look now, I think what you'll see is I think what we did our last sort of supply chain update blog in December. We expect to probably come back in weirdly. We will come back into general availability in broadly the order that we launched the products. So I think we said that 0 would come back in first, and then 3A+. Then the other 3 products, and then finally 4, which of course is difficult for hobbyists because I know a lot of hobbyists, they really want the latest and shiniest product, the Raspberry Pi 4. I think what you see today, if you go on RPi Locator, we do encourage people to use some of these online tools to locate these pockets of supply. Go on RPi Locator today, you'll see that 3A+ is in very broad availability. 0 is, I think, coming back into availability. So 3A+ and 0 have come back into availability in the opposite order from what I predicted in December, but they're coming back at about the time that we suggested. I think as we get on through this quarter, you're going to see patchy availability of 3+, and 4. And then as I say, from kind of July onwards, that's when you get the really big hits.
Yeah, I'm just going to take on the role of some of the comments I've seen on YouTube, especially the hobby like sort of crowd. And they feel, you're not looking after them perhaps because you're prioritizing like certain, I mean, things have changed, haven't they? Because originally it was supposed to be for education, and then people who, use it as a hobby got involved, and then it became more industrial. I hate to put you on the spot, but what would you say to them? You're not doing this on purpose, are you?
Nobody is doing this on purpose. This isn't a Raspberry Pi specific problem, but it is a problem, and I think I've said it's the hardest decision I've had to make in 12 years of running Raspberry Pi.
I've heard you say it's really painful for you.
It's incredibly painful, right? Because I'm a hobbyist, right? I mean, I'm in this for the hobby side. I'm not in this I'm not an OEM. I'm a hobbyist, right? I think what we got to remember is when we talk about OEMs, when we talk about industry, you're not talking about billion-dollar companies. Yeah. There are billion-dollar companies using Raspberry Pis, deploying Raspberry Pis at scale. We have a few of these kind of whales, people who want hundreds of thousands of Raspberry Pis a year. But by and large, when we talk about, I've said we have 2,500, 3,000 OEMs, that kind of implies your average size of OEM customer is, on the order of 1,000 units a year. A lot of these are mom and pop organizations, small businesses. These are people who won't make the mortgage if they can't get Raspberry Pis. At the point where somebody has designed a Raspberry Pi into a product, there is a moral obligation to try to supply them with material. That balance, striking that balance between supplying OEMs, keeping OEMs alive, and supplying individuals. It's an incredibly difficult balance to strike. I think probably, one place where you see the consequence of us trying to make these decisions is in this sort of differential return to availability that you're seeing, something like 0 or 3A+, that doesn't have a substantial OEM footprint. Those are the devices that we see. So we're doing our best, and what our best looks like is bringing the products that don't have a substantial OEM footprint back into general consumer availability first, and then backfilling with a product like Raspberry Pi 4. Raspberry Pi 4 and Compute Module 4, which both consume from the same, because this is all about core silicon. You see these FIFOs of core silicon coming in. So, 2835 for Pi 1 and Pi 0, 2837 of various sorts for Pi 3 and 3 Plus, and Compute Module 3. And then 2711, and those are all 40 nanometer chips. And then 2711, which is a 28 nanometer chip, you see that. That's a different FIFO. And so you see these FIFOs, they have different incoming rates and they have different levels of OEM demand pulling on them. The 2711 based products, the Pi 4 and CM4, were such a massive and instant success in the industrial space that those are the ones that are going to take the longest to come back into general availability.
I've heard you say this, and I think people maybe don't know about it or forget about it, that the software that runs on the latest Pi 4, that can still run on older versions, right?
Yeah, that's right. And an enormous amount of work goes in here into maintaining everything all the way back to we have the boards which are called alpha boards, which are they don't even look like a Raspberry Pi. They're so old that you have a completely different form factor, and they're from the summer of 2011. The software, and there are about 50 of those in existence, and we have between 5 and 10 of them here in this building. And there are people in the wild who have those and will complain if a new release doesn't run on this 256 meg alpha board from the summer of 2011. We put an enormous amount of work into it. What that does mean is, if you need the raw computing power of a Pi 4, then it's hard times at the moment.
Yeah.
But if you need a machine that can run the platform and you're prepared to put up with lower levels of performance, we are already, it's April, we're already in a position where there is very, very good availability of some of those devices that run the software stack.
That's very different to other companies where you think you have to get the latest to be able to use all the product.
Yeah.
So what you're saying is even if I get like a Pi Zero, I can do stuff at home. I can learn. I don't need to get the latest and greatest and most expensive product.
Yeah, and we're working as hard as we can to bring the latest, greatest. Yeah, we love Pi 4. We're putting, just as we put an enormous amount of effort into maintaining compatibility with the older devices, we put an enormous amount of software effort into in between major generations of Raspberry Pi. You always see an increase in the performance of the latest and greatest device that tends to be driven by software optimization. So, that is the latest and greatest device. It's probably the place where most software optimization effort is going, here at Pi Taz. And so, of course, we want to get that into people's hands, but we've all the way through this situation, we've tried to find mitigations. We've tried to find ways that people can stay engaged with the platform. We've continued to produce new accessories. We launched an enormous number of camera products this year, and there is a school of thought that says, why are you producing these camera products? You can't buy Raspberry Pis. Well, lots of people have Raspberry Pis. To give people interesting new hobbyist experiences, to give people interesting new educational experiences, you don't necessarily have to ship a new Pi. You can ship some sort of new accessory which just lets people get a little bit more out of the hardware they already own.
Yeah, I feel for you because, I think you're in an impossible situation because I think you've mentioned it in previous interviews I've watched. Your sales were like flatlining rather than what you were hoping.
If you look at our annual sales figures, 6 million in 2019, 7 million in 2020, unconstrained. Weird year, but unconstrained, right?
Yeah.
7 million in 2021, very, very substantial constraint conditions. So if you imagine that year, we went into that year with 500,000 units of customer backlog, left the year with 4.5 million units of customer backlog. Now, you can't just add those numbers together. You can't just add 7 and 4 and say that would have been an 11 million unit year because there's the toilet paper. The toilet paper dynamics are in there, double ordering, triple ordering for buffer. Ordering for buffer build, but it's clear that there was an increase in demand. I think we may have seen an increase in demand as other platforms became less available, as other embedded modular platforms became less available. You saw people migrating to Raspberry Pi, not just because they liked the platform, but out of a perception that it had good availability. So you sort of see an increase in demand in 2021 and in an inability to grow the business in order to meet that demand. And then last year, 5 million units. Right, so you see an actual decline in, for the first time ever in Raspberry Pi history, you see a decline in our production numbers.
7 million to 5 million, that's quite
7 million to 5 million. And you can sort of see that if you think that maybe 60, 70% of your demand is OEM industrial demand, then and you attempt to fill that demand, that explains why there's not been a huge amount of volume left over to serve our original core market. It's incredibly painful. These are incredibly painful decisions. These are not. I don't kind of not throwing myself on anyone's sympathy, but they are not trivial decisions. And they cause pain to people about whom we care enormously. And so you go looking for mitigations. You try to do what you can. You try to find pools of inventory that can be allocated. You try to find ways to, we have a wonderful network of approved resellers. And of course, I feel for our approved resellers because that's their businesses as well. Some of our approved resellers have both an industrial and a consumer practice, and those people have been a little bit insulated from these challenges. Some of them are very, very consumer focused, and those people, if we're not giving them stock to sell, they can't run their businesses. And again, many of those are mom and pop businesses, right? So you've got this kind of balance. So you're trying to find pockets of inventory that you can allocate into consumer. You're working with your reseller partners to try to find ways to avoid scalping. If a unit that goes into the
big problem.
Yeah, absolutely, right. And we've largely got in front of it now, but there was a period of time where you did have people who were buying units and then reselling them on eBay.
Yeah.
And that's painful. That's just painful to us. We don't want to see someone having to pay $100 for a $50 product, $150 for a $50 product. That's not the vision, right? So a lot of our resellers have got extremely creative in the way that they've tried to avoid this kind of behavior. Adafruit, for example, you've got to say they do two-factor authentication. Effectively, you can buy a Raspberry Pi per cell phone number. These sorts of things where you find something that is expensive to have lots of cell phone numbers, and then you tie sales to that object. Your driving license. Present your driving license, and you can buy one NVIDIA graphics card per quarter per driving license. So you get people coming up with these creative solutions. We think we have got in front of it, but it's I don't think we'd ever attempt to deny the pain and the difficulty that this has caused people.
It's affecting all of us.
Yes.
You didn't start this to, just try and make money.
Yeah.
You started this for a good reason. So let's perhaps talk about that a bit.
Yeah, let's do that.
How did it start? Because it's kind of changed. The original vision has changed a bit over time because you're talking about OEMs and stuff like that.
Yeah.
But perhaps you can take us back in time.
Let's take it all the way back in time, all the way back to the 1980s. So I was a kid in the 1980s, and I had a BBC microcomputer. So I had this, another great Cambridge designed. Yeah. You look back to the days of EDSAC, of Morris Wilks designing, building EDSAC at the university in the late 40s, early 50s. People have always built computers in Cambridge, and there are two kind of great. There were a number of them in the 80s, but of course two hugely successful and influential ones: the BBC Micro, which is made by a company called Acorn, which then went on to become ARM, and then you have the Sinclair Spectrum, which was produced by Sinclair Research. You go all the way back, and in the corner of every classroom in Britain there was this beige box, and you turn it on and it goes boop, and makes this lovely little two-tone kind of beeping sound, gives you a programming prompt. And I got my introduction to computing through one of these machines. That's where, if you walk out into the office here and you talk to engineers, the vast majority of people are vaguely my age, between their 30s and their 50s, will have got their first experience of computing, their first experience of engineering using some sort of platform like that. And really what Raspberry Pi is, Raspberry Pi has its origins in a recognition in about 2005 that the disappearance of those machines kind of became non-current in the early 1990s, that a delayed action effect of that, the disappearance of those machines, was a decline in interest in computing among young people. Yeah. And that was feeding into university recruitment, it was feeding into industrial recruitment, it had all sorts of negative consequences. Had negative consequences for the country. Of course, I also believe it had negative consequences for individuals. One of the really, really interesting things about those machines was that you were finding people. Always been very focused on Cambridge because it's somewhere I love, and I have this great relationship with the university. But actually, one of the interesting things about these machines was it was providing a gateway into good, stable, white-collar employment for people who wouldn't have considered themselves to be particularly academic. People who would sit down in front of their Spectrum and suddenly go, hang on a second, I can write a computer game and I can sell this. I can burn it onto a cassette and I can sell it to people for money, and I can go work for a games company. I can leave school at 16 and I can, spend my life in a really great white collar job, right? So there are all of these advantages to the general availability of general purpose computing in people's homes, which is a historical accident. These machines weren't in people's homes because there was some grand design. There was maybe a little bit with the BBC Micro, but there wasn't really a grand design to promote computer literacy. It was just that it happened that the cheapest object, the most convenient object you could build that would do the things people wanted to do, play computer games, do their schoolwork, do their taxes. The cheapest object you could build to do that was the general purpose programmable computer. And so you kind of get all of these side effects from the general existence of these machines, both for individuals and for institutions and for the country. These machines disappear. all these nice side effects go away. And really Raspberry Pi, starting in about 2006 through to 2008, when we incorporated the foundation, was kind of hunting for a way to build a platform, originally at a very small scale, to build a platform that we could get into the hands of young people to reboot some of that enthusiasm.
I love what you said there, because, I mean, people who perhaps are really good at programming are not perhaps good like in a typical white collar type job.
Yeah.
But I mean, computing gives you so many options.
Yeah, it's wonderful. And I mean, I've had a very traditional and very academic route, I guess, through the first 25 to 30 years of my life. So I went to school. I studied. I specialised in science in the sixth form, 16 to 18. I went to work for IBM for a year. I was very, very lucky that IBM had a wonderful pre-university program. A chap called Ian Nussey, who ran their pre-university program, would go out and get 50 to 60 18-year-olds every year, give them a year at IBM doing real work. And the wonderful thing about Ian was that he'd recruit people. He'd have some in his group in Warwick in the Midlands in the UK, and then he'd farm them out to other IBM locations in the UK. I was very lucky to be in his group. But, of the 60, say, 50 of them wouldn't have been in his group. But God help you if you took one of Ian's pre-university employees and made them make the tea or do photocopying. You had to give them real work to do. And I used to sit near his office, and I used to hear him shouting. Every now and then he'd be on the phone to somebody shouting at them because he discovered that a PUE had been betrayed and had been made to make the coffee. So I did that, came to Cambridge, did my undergraduate, dropped out of my undergraduate actually to run a games company, founded a games company when I was a third year here, did that, sold that, did a PhD. So kind of very traditional academic flow through, but kind of in parallel with that academic track, that kind of very craftsman-like thing. I started a games company. I've always been kind of interested in the craft of computing, the craft of computer programming, the craft of software development. There are some people who only have the academic side, and there are some people who only have the craft side. I mean, as I say, I've met some amazing engineers, software engineers, left school at 16, never felt they needed to do anything else. They just went straight into a programming job and thrived in it. And so you get some people who have both sides, but I think what's worked well for me and what we tried to promote with Raspberry Pi, and what I think giving academically minded young people access to a general purpose computer gives is the opportunity to have both sides, is the opportunity to have both and it doesn't really matter which order you learn them in. I learned the craft. I was writing assembly language when I was 14. I learned the craft, and then I learned the theory. But you get people who learn the theory and then the craft. But if you don't have some sort of platform that you can hack around on and a low consequence environment, we talk about Raspberry Pis, this says you've got a Raspberry Pi Zero there. It's a $5, it was $10 now, but was a $5 machine. Machines that are so cheap and that are fully featured Unix machines, but are so cheap that if you break it, you can just go and get another one. Giving people that kind of low consequence hacking environment is a really important contributor to building these rounded, both to giving the people who don't consider themselves to be academic a route in, and to give the people who do consider themselves to be academic to have a kind of a more rounded approach to what computing really means.
You mentioned the word hacking, and a lot of people that watch my channel are into hacking of various types. I believe there's a story you said when you were at school where you know where I'm going? You can tell the story.
I do. This is about me having the school with 12 classes and 13 accounts. There was a series of machines there was a company called Research Machines. They still exist, and they built a machine called the Nimbus, which was actually a slightly horrible machine. And it was one of these nearly IBM compatible machines. It's sort of an Intel 8086, 8088 based machine. It was almost IBM compatible, and we had one of these with an Ethernet 10 base T Ethernet running around this. Every class had an account, and I somehow managed to jailbreak my way out of the class, out of the sandbox that the classes were in to get myself access, particularly to BASIC. I mean, on any of these machines, the goal was get yourself access either to a DOS prompt or to a BASIC prompt. So
they would force you into a sandbox, like you could only use certain applications.
Yeah,
is that right?
That's
and then
right.
You broke
and usually it was a matter of finding something you could write to the disk, or finding a moment, a crack, a moment where hitting the right key would drop you out. Usually when you were launching an application, if I hit the right key here, then it'll drop me to something will crash and it'll drop me to a prompt. And I managed to, in both my middle school and my secondary school, I was able to find ways to get out the sandbox. And of course, the way what you get paid for getting out of the sandbox and for not teaching other children how to get out of the sandbox is you get your own account. You get your own account with no sandbox. And so both my middle school and my secondary school, I had privileged network access. It's interesting because what's really important, as much as, you look at what we tried to build at the foundation in terms of infrastructure, it's very easy to, particularly because we're at Raspberry Pi Limited here, we're at the trading subsidiary of the foundation. It's very easy to focus on the physical objects or the hardware objects or the software objects. But a lot of what we've actually tried to build with the Raspberry Pi organization is to build the organizational infrastructure, the social infrastructure, to rebuild the social infrastructure that you require in order to have a good experience with computing. So, what did the social infrastructure look like for me as a child? Teachers who'd respond to me hacking the school network by giving me an account on my own private account rather than sending me to the headmaster and putting me in detention, right? People who would engage with well-intentioned but some potentially disruptive enthusiasm in a positive rather than a negative way. I talk a lot about, there's a fellow called Alan Drew who sadly is no longer with us. He ran IT for Leeds Permanent Building Society, one of the large financial institutions in Leeds, when I grew up in Yorkshire. And every other Friday evening, he would come around to my house in his MPV, and I would have packed up my BBC Micro in its expanded polystyrene case, and he would drive me to the local college, and we go to computer club from 7:30 to 9:30 in the evening every other Friday. And that was just a wonderful environment for me because it gave me a venue to see what other people. It gave me a venue to show off. It gave me a venue to show what I'd made, and it gave me a venue to see what other people had made and be inspired, be encouraged, be inspired, be chastised for things I hadn't done a good thing. And so you kind of look at what the foundation's been doing. How does that reflect in the foundation's activities? Well, a big focus on clubs, Code Club and Coder Dojo, the kind of two big club programs, and then the teacher training programs, Pi Academy, and then the National Centre for Computing Education. The foundation's been very focused on generating both the informal out of school or after school environments, but also ensuring that teachers are well equipped to be enthusiastic, to not feel threatened by a child who comes and does something wacky in class. You actually feel that they've got the support, feel they've got the knowledge, feel they've got the collateral behind them required to deliver a quality computer learning experience to everybody.
I love that though, because your teachers didn't, like you say, send you to the headmaster.
Yeah.
They kind of like grew that passion that you had.
Yeah.
They didn't try and lock it away.
Mr. Stewart and Mr. Wright.
Kudos to them, because if they had like come on top of you like a ton of bricks, we might not have had this today.
That's it, right? You can everyone can everyone who's had a positive trajectory in computing can put their finger on one or two moments where they might have had a negative experience or just a neutral experience. You have this learning curve that has 10 print I am the best, 20 go to 10 at one end of it, and has I'm a professional computer scientist, chip designer, software engineer at the other end of it. And a lot of the work that we do is about sanding that learning curve. It's about taking the bumps out, and providing people with the underpinnings, because everyone's going to hit you're never going to sand it completely smooth. Everyone is going to hit some kind of road bump at some point. And the question is, what infrastructure do you have to support you? And what infrastructure do you have? I grew up in a lovely town. My father was an academic. I had a lot of privilege as a child, so I don't talk about too much about privilege, but I had a wonderful, privileged, blessed childhood. But a lot of people don't have that. And so you'll find if you grew up in Cambridge, your school will be besieged by volunteers to run after school clubs. If you're 30 miles north of here, up in Norfolk, maybe your school has nobody who is interested in running an after school club. You maybe have no volunteers in the community. It's one of the reasons why engagement with teachers is so important. I come from this kind of anarchist kind of approach to this, where everything I did was like let's hack the school network, let's go to a club, let's go to an after school club and then go to the pub afterwards. I come from that kind of world, and when I came into Raspberry Pi, that was the ethos that I brought with me. And probably, we talk about the various ways in which our thinking has matured. And one of the ways is the idea that that is an incredibly That is the product of an incredibly privileged background to think that that is a viable strategy for all children everywhere. And actually that engagement with the formal education system is the thing that gives people the underpinning, is the thing that gives people the backstop, the guarantee that they will get some exposure to computing. If you go and look at the computer industry, we hark back to the 1980s and it was a wonderful time. But if you go and look at the diversity of people in the computing industry, middle-aged people in the computing industry, it's all people who look like me.
Yep.
It's all people, it's white men from middle-class backgrounds. Why is it white men from middle-class backgrounds? Because those were the people who were messing around with computers in the 1980s and 1990s. By engaging with the formal system, that's the only way that you're going to reach the people. That's the only way that you're not going to continue to perpetuate the demographic weirdness of our industry. And it's great. I hope we always have lots of people who look like me in this industry, but I hope that we also, one of the interesting things when you look at the people who are participating in Code Club, for example, which is the Foundations program for 9 to 13-year-olds, it looks a lot more like society. Over 40% of the people going to Code Club are girls. At a critical age, 9 to 13, at a critical age where girls often disengage a little bit from the society, something in the culture tends to, at a point where girls are often performing as well or better than boys, something in the culture starts to tell girls that this is not for them. If you're a school which has a large number of deprived children, if you measure deprivation by the proportion of people who are entitled to free school meals, subsidized school meals, if you're a school with a high index of deprivation, you are slightly more likely to have a code club than if you're a school with a low level of deprivation. What that means is if we kind of look 20, 30, 40 years into the future, there's real opportunity, there's real chance that if you were to walk out into an office, into a computing office, that the people you would see would be in all dimensions much more representative of society as a whole. And that's got to be a good thing, right? These are amazing opportunities, and we have to make sure that the two angles, one for individuals, they're amazing opportunities, and we have to make sure that people have access to those opportunities. Two, we're an industry that's massively hungry for talent, and we can't afford to let some pool of talent sit idle, sit fallow. We can't afford to not discover that great computer programmer who happens to be from some underrepresented background.
I love that. I mean, the story, if I understand it correctly, originally was you had Cambridge, and you noticed like the student applicants were going down, and Cambridge is obviously very different to like people perhaps in Africa. You've been in Africa. Yeah. What you've created has fulfilled that, because you can tell the story obviously much better than me, but like the applicant numbers went up, but you've also affected the whole world.
It's amazing how moderate the vision was, I suppose, that we were
to what it's become.
It's we thought, well, we'll build 1,000 units and we'll get them into the hands of the right 1,000 kids. And then if a tenth of those apply to study computer science at Cambridge, we want to find about 100 kids a year to come to Cambridge to study computing. And we were down to about 200 applicants. I mean, that's incredible, right? In 2008, if you wanted to get your kid into Cambridge to read physics, the best way to get them in was to get them to apply to computer science and then switch once they're here, right? There aren't many courses at Cambridge that have a 2-to-1 application ratio, right? And so this is a really simple ambition, give out 1,000 computers, get an extra 100 applicants. Oh, now we got 300 applicants for 100 places. That's really a material change. Now, what's actually happened is devices have gone out in vastly larger numbers than that, and they've gone out in a vastly more disorganized way. It's not that kind of rifle shot, that kind of like let's go snipe that population there. Let's go get these people. It's this very broad deployment of units. Only a small number of which have got into education, but that small fraction is still vastly more than 1,000 units. Last year we had about 1,500 applicants. It's gone from being one of the easiest courses to get into to being absolutely one of the most challenging courses. People should still apply. We do still need talent, but it is certainly very challenging. And we've seen that. And that's not just us. That's all of these other people who woke up at about the same time and realized there was a problem and tried to solve it. All the people who started after school clubs, all the organizations that started trying to train teachers, the government's curriculum reform. I mean, we have an incredibly better curriculum. You compare the curriculum, the very office skills-centric ICT curriculum that we had back in 2012 that was then disapplied and replaced by this completely insane, well-designed computer science curriculum from about 2015 onwards. So you see all of these things have happened, and they've all had a contribution, but the aggregate effect at Cambridge has been measurable in this kind of sort of 7-fold increase in the number of applicants between 2008 and about 2019. And you see that mirrored everywhere else. You see that mirrored elsewhere in the UK. You see that kind of resurgence elsewhere in the world. Raspberry Pi, I think, has been an important part of it. But the interesting thing is that our ambitions have grown. As we've succeeded more, we've got hungrier. We haven't got less hungry, we've got hungrier. And so the question is, can we do it? Okay, we've done it for Cambridge. Can we do it for other institutions in the UK? We've done it in the UK. Can we do it in other developed world countries? We've done it in the developed world. Can we do it in low and middle income countries? One of the things I'm absolutely most excited about at the moment is our impact in Africa. I've had a chance over the last 6 months to go to Ghana, to go to Kenya. I'm just back from Morocco.
Oh, wow.
And you just see this level of desire, this level of hunger for the opportunities that general purpose computing brings, the economic opportunities, the educational opportunities, the chance for advancement for the individual, the chance for advancement for a country. In Morocco, went to the University of Mohammed VI Polytechnic, about halfway between Marrakesh and Casablanca. These vast buildings, this enormous technology university that's been built over the last 10 years, really on a greenfield site in Morocco. And just that ambition, you talk to the people there, and you see that there is the ambition not to catch up with what we have here in the UK, what people have in North America, what people have elsewhere in Western Europe, but to leapfrog over it. A real desire to kind of seize control of their sort of technological destiny, and to do that not just for one country, not just for Morocco, but to share that advancement with all the countries in North Africa and in sub-Saharan Africa. From day one, we've always had a very strong reseller presence in South Africa. And so for a long time, Africa for us really meant South Africa. I think as it's the case for a lot of technology companies, right? Africa really means maybe South Africa, maybe some of the countries in North Africa, maybe Egypt, but certainly other bits of Francophone North Africa and sub-Saharan Africa are not really figuring on. Mike Buffum, who's our chief commercial officer, he said I went to Kenya with him. October last year, and we did a panel, and he said, he's had roles at a lot of, before Raspberry Pi, roles at a lot of electronics companies, distribution companies for 30 years, all of which have global in their title. And the first time he went to Africa was in January last year. It's crazy. Right? It's incredible, right?
Yeah. And there's so much talent and young talent. So many young people.
It's a young continent, right? Yeah. It's a young continent. A couple of years ago, just before the pandemic, we hired a chap called Ken Okolo, who's based in Lagos. He was introduced to us. We're very lucky that we have John Lazar, who's the chairman of the foundation, is a South African, originally has a real focus on kind of, I guess, entrepreneurial engagement in Africa. And he was able to introduce us to Ken. Ken joined us as our strategic partnership director in Africa. And really what he's been doing since he joined us is actually not, some of the aspects of how the market works are different in Africa, but really what he's building is infrastructure which feels very familiar to us. What he's doing is he's building reseller networks. The thing that's powered the adoption of Raspberry Pi in our kind of existing core markets is this network of about 100 approved resellers who we regulate their pricing. We require them to sell at no more than a certain price. We provide them with access to our products at a favorable price. We provide them with clickstream. So if you come to our website and click on buy for a product, we will geolocate you and send you to an approved reseller in your local geography. So the approved resellers are kind of the heart of the Raspberry Pi kind of outbound operation. We haven't had those in Africa, and what we've been doing is country by country booting up very familiar looking AR networks. The way that those ARs do business with their customers is often different from the way that you would do that in the UK. The way that we get product to them is often different. There are often some logistical challenges, taxation challenges, duty challenges involved in getting hardware to them. But what they're doing is very familiar. what they're doing. They are just approved resellers. We were in Morocco in March, onboarded an approved reseller who looks like they're about to become our largest approved reseller, kind of almost from a standing start to become our largest approved reseller outside of South Africa. People who've been actually selling Raspberry Pis for a long period of time, but not as an approved reseller. And that's non-approved resellers is fine. There's nothing wrong with non-approved resellers. It just means these are not people where we this is somewhere where we don't regulate the buying experience. And so you take somebody who's been actually a passionate advocate for Raspberry Pi for a number of years, but outside the tent, you bring them into the tent and you give them access to supply and you give them access to pricing. And all of a sudden these things, they explode. And they're exploding because they're a little bit like Raspberry Pi in the UK in 2012. There is latent demand for these products in the African market, and all we're doing is we're dropping well-developed, obviously products which are vastly more sophisticated than our 2012 era product. We're dropping these products into like putting a crystal in a supersaturated solution. You drop them in, and bang, suddenly you're accessing this enormous reservoir of demand. It's amazing.
I mean, the computer industry needs more and more people. I mean, and what you're doing is you're empowering all of these people to learn. I wanted to ask you, you've used this term a few times today, and I've heard you use it before, general purpose computing versus, say, an iPhone. Yeah. What's the difference and why is this so important?
We are really passionate advocates for general purpose computing. So a general purpose computer it's a Turing machine, right? It's a thing that can do anything. You can program it to do anything. You can sit in front of it and you can program it to do anything a computer can do.
You were thinking people would use it for games, and then you use this example of cucumbers or something.
Yeah,
right?
That's it. So that's the lovely thing about general purpose computing is how you unlock creativity when you put if you put special purpose computers out in the world, all they can be used for is the thing that you intended them for. So you put a games console out in the world, it gets used to play computer games. You put a mobile phone out in the world, it gets used to make phone calls, run apps, but fundamentally run apps that other people have developed somewhere else. Play content that other people have created, not create really meaningful content yourself. When you make an appliance, you bound the things that people do with it. The point about general purpose computers is you can do literally anything. So when I conceived of Raspberry Pi, I didn't want to put the GPIO header on there. I didn't see what the point was of the GPIO header. And Pete Lomas, one of my co-founders, designed the Raspberry Pi 1. And he said, well, look, you've got these GPIO pins on the chip. We should bring them to a header. And I'm like, are you sure? I'm not sure how robust those pins are. What if someone sends static shocks into them with their finger? And so I wasn't designing it, so I yielded to his enthusiasm for it.
Thank goodness.
Of course, thank goodness. I mean, if I hadn't, then my vision that people were going to use. I suffered from a paucity of vision. I thought that because I used my BBC and my Amiga to write computer games, that's what people would do with Raspberry Pis. And it turns out the majority of what people in education do with Raspberry Pis is physical computing. They do robotics, they do sensing, they do monitoring, they do those sorts of things. And that's what gets people excited. So you see, it's the power of general purpose computing. General purpose computing doesn't have to exist. As I think I said earlier, there was a period of time when the general purpose computer just happened. If you wanted to play computer games, the cheapest thing you could make and give to somebody to do that happened to be a general purpose computer. And then over time, people found ways to make both technical and business model innovations enabled the rise probably of certainly the 16 and 32-bit games consoles were a combination of technical and business innovation, which kind of nibbled away at a big fraction of the deployed base of general purpose computers. And there's really no reason why that nibbling won't continue until there are no general purpose computers. I mean, the Chromebook is a fascinating example of this. Yeah. What was the remaining citadel really of general purpose computing until Raspberry Pi came along? The remaining citadel of general purpose computing in the consumer world was the PC and the Mac, and those were largely laptops. And that felt like a very secure citadel. But of course, the Chromebook is a really interesting attack on that. People have managed to figure out a way to make an object that looks a lot like a laptop, can do most of the things that consumers want from a laptop, and yet is not really a general purpose computer. And so Raspberry Pi, we will always make general purpose computers. There is no point in us making appliances. That's not what we're on the planet for. We sold 50 million of them, right? We put a lot of general purpose computers into the wild. And we're just passionate advocates for it on all fronts, both as an educational tool, but also as a platform for OEM customers, for industrial customers to innovate around.
Eben, I've heard rumors rumours, and I think you've said it on other interviews about perhaps a possible IPO.
Yeah, I mean, we have this piece of paper I read from time to time that says we look for when people ask that question. We always look at ways of funding the future growth of our company. We looked at the possibility of doing an IPO. We invested a little bit of money. I think you can see this from our accounts. We invested a little bit of money in, I guess, 2020 calendar 21. In understanding whether an IPO might be a track we could go down. The semiconductor shortage, two problems with doing an IPO for the business, certainly in that sort of time frame. One, the shortage makes it hard to be predictable. It makes it hard to understand what the business is going to do and what does the market want. The market wants predictability. And the other thing is just generally there is this notion the markets are closed. By this time last year, the markets were closed. There was a huge amount of IPO activity in 2021, and then there was really no IPO. Certainly in London, there was no IPO activity really in 2022. So that's not really something that we have been able to pursue. I mean, I'm not saying it's something we won't come back to. I mean, it's a potential path in particular. It's a potential path for the foundation to realize some of the value. In the trading company, Raspberry Pi Limited. So it's something. I mean, it was an interesting journey. Investigating it was an interesting journey. We met some great people, had some great conversations, and it is something. It might be something we'll come back to in a few years.
You've developed your own custom silicon, is that right?
Yeah, that's right. So January 2021, we released Raspberry Pi Pico, which is it's a lovely product. But the thing that's really interesting about it is it's the first time we've released a product where the core silicon was also designed at Raspberry Pi. So we talk about it being a board that has two Raspberry Pi logos on it. It has a logo on the board and it has a logo on the chip. Now, that turned up at a really interesting time for us. It turned up just as the supply chain challenges were starting to bite in our core business. We talked about mitigations. We talked about trying to find our enthusiast community other things to be enthusiastic about, other things to be involved with during this kind of difficult period. Being able to offer a platform in Pico and RP2040, which we knew we could make as many as we want. There was no problem. If you want 10 million Picos or 10 million RP2040s, I can probably deliver them to you pretty quickly. There's no real constraint on my doing that. So having an unconstrained platform during this difficult time is nice. RP2040 is a lovely chip. Our team here did an amazing job designing it. It's very nearly perfect. In a way that, an application processor, the big chips that go into the big products can never be perfect. They're too large, they're too complicated to ever be kind of perfectable. They're extremely good, but they're not perfect. That chip is within its kind of design envelope is pretty much as good as it could possibly be. And it's very kind of satisfying to have been involved with and to be shipping a product based on a piece of silicon that's just right, something that's based on, the team here. They've been working with microcontrollers for decades individually, obviously within the organization. Raspberry Pi has been shipping microcontroller-based products for a decade. The core, not the core product, but the accessory products almost all have microcontrollers of some sort in. Individuals have been involved with microcontrollers for decades. Everyone accumulates kind of ideas of what's good, what's bad. What features did I enjoy in this microcontroller? What features do I wish I'd had? And really, our RP2040 is kind of a, I guess, a consolidation of all of those insights that members of the team have had over the years, all of them consolidated down into this piece of silicon. Obviously a piece of silicon that's on a fairly advanced process node by microcontroller standards on 40 nanometers. We get about 21,000 die out of each 300 millimeter wafer. One of the reasons why it's in good supply. Get 25 wafers, it's 500,000 chips. Kind of the minimum unit of wafers that you'll get from a foundry is generally a cartridge, 25 wafers. It's 500,000 chips. And so even fairly small supplies of upstream wafer starts turns into a lot of inventory for us.
But I mean, that raises the issue, like, how do you fund that? I'm assuming it costs a lot of money to design all of that, and rather than just use merchant silicon?
Yeah, I mean, RP2040, I think, was about my mental model of it. And it's always interesting to look in the accounts and see whether your mental model aligns with reality. Is that it was about a $5 million.
Wow.
About a $5 million program.
And you sell them for?
We sell them for 50 cents.
Wow.
Right?
It's a lot of investment.
And we're not making 50 cents on each unit. It's not a thing that costs 10 cents to make. So you sell it for 50 cents, you wholesale at 50 cents. Retail at between 70 cents and $1, depending on depending on volume. So you got to sell. If you wanted to make your money back on chips alone, you'd have to sell 20, 30, 40, 50 million chips. Now, the interesting thing, of course, is we're in a privileged position because we also make Pico. We make the product that's built on the chip. And, of course, the margins on that, again, that's a $4 product for Pico, but the margins on Pico are substantially better than the margins on RP2040. So you can kind of say, well, look, I'm gonna pay this program back on the back of Pico, which I couldn't have done without it. And then I'm not going to feel so bad about the fact that I'm only making 10 cents on an RP2040.
How do you fund that? Is IPO an option? Is like private? Do you have private investors?
It's a little bit of a mix. I mean, historically, Raspberry Pi was entirely funded it was organically funded.
So from sales?
Yeah, just from sales, just from profits on selling Raspberry Pis and accessories. So, over the years, we've returned between 30 and 40 million pounds to the foundation, to our shareholder, but we retain some of the profits we make inside our organization as well. And that's the money that's paid for things like programs like Raspberry Pi 4. Raspberry Pi 4 was not a cheap program. Programs like RP2040 and Pico, it's what will fund whatever when we decide what we're going to do next, it's what will fund what we do next.
How do you decide what to make? Like, you've been through so many different products. Like, we've got some of them here, and some of them we don't. But how do you decide what to make?
We make what we want to make. We make what we want ourselves. It's an unfashionable way of making of designing products, I guess, these days. You're supposed to focus group everything to death. The nice thing about making a product that you want, I think there's another fruit company that's famous for doing this as well, right?
Yep.
If you make products that you want, then at least one person wants them. If you make products by focus grouping and by interpolating, the thing that I think is a killer in product design is where you identify two genuine pools of demand, and then you think, wow, it'd be efficient if I could make one product that serves both these pools of demand. So you interpolate and you make some products in the middle that lands between the two and is of no interest to either side. So it's very easy, if you do that kind of approach, to make a product that has no customers. If you make a product you want, at least there's one customer. And in practice, there's a lot of people like me. There's a lot of people like it's not like I sit down and design these products myself. We all sit down together and decide what we want to build. There's a lot of people like us. And that's why there's demand for Raspberry Pi, because we are an engineer-led organization that is designing products that are appealing to engineers.
I love that, because I think a lot of people, especially the techie people watching, will say that companies lose their way when it's all about sales and it's no longer the engineers.
Yeah, and it doesn't always hit. I mean, we've had some products. TV Hat, I think, was not the biggest success in the world. I mean, it sold out. We're always fairly conservative, particularly when we do something which is novel. We're always fairly conservative about how many we make. We do always trade out eventually, but we have a few products that took a few years to trade out. The initial build volume, I think TV Hat was the obvious example. And we have, a good example of a recent product, the Global Shutter camera. I mean, it's an amazing product, but again, it's a product that has it could be quite nichey.
I was going to say it's a niche product.
Yeah, it's going to be super interesting to a niche, and we don't know how big that niche is, and so we've been quite conservative about how many of those we build. Even though we really believe in it as a product, we have to not get ourselves in a situation where we're sitting on $1 million of stock that's going to take us 20 years to sell, right?
You've walked a journey, and I mean, you've shared some of the products that you make are the products that you'd want, but you've walked this road now, and there's a lot of people watching that are perhaps starting their journey, or they're inspired by you. Many people are inspired by you. What advice would you give your younger self or someone who's starting out? We've spoken about some of this offline, and I
have a general reservation about advice, right?
Yeah, sure.
And the general reservation is that a lot of what's happened to anyone who is successful in business is they've been lucky. And you can stack the deck and you can make your own luck. But in the end, I look at the history of Raspberry Pi, and so many of the things which were really, really meaningful to us were very contingent. They didn't have to happen. It was somebody bumped into a guy, Alan Mycroft, one of our founding trustees, bumped into Pete Lomas, another founding trustee who designed the first product, bumped into him at some conference at Imperial and took him for a walk in Hyde Park and told him about what we're trying to do and recruited him that way. So, you have those kind of, they're often personal relationships, kind of happenstance. So that's it's an important caveat. And anyone who stands up and says, I made it in business because I'm a goddamn genius is a liar. Is a liar, is delusional. I mean, you can stack the deck. I mean, things that have been good for us, things that have been good for me, getting in touch with the market early. People talk about minimum viable products, building minimum viable products. It's easy to sit in an ivory tower and think about what the perfect product would be and spend years working on it, when really, if you got in touch with the market, well, there's nothing to stop you keeping working after you've launched that first product. You can keep working, you can keep fettling it, but you'll be fettling it in the context of having market feedback. And that's been very good to us. I do have an MBA, and I'm quite an advocate for doing an MBA at some point in your career. It doesn't have, a little bit like I'm an advocate for hacking on computers when you're 8 years old and then doing a computer science degree. I'm kind of an advocate for founding a bunch of businesses and screwing them up, and then to some degree. And then doing an MBA. I'm much more of an advocate for that than I am doing a computer science degree if you've never programmed a computer, or doing an MBA if you've never started a business, right? I did the MBA here at Cambridge, and I found there were a lot of really useful strategic insights, particularly about how you structure a business to be sustainable in the long run, how you manage talent, how you decide what work you're going to do inside the organization and what work you're going to do outside the organization. Companies are so ubiquitous in the world that people don't think very much about why companies exist at all. Like, why can't we have a world which is just built out of free contractors, freely contracting entities that do commercial transactions with each other? And of course, you have this tension. That approach doesn't work because you have transaction cost economics, right? It's very labor intensive to constantly set up and tear down commercial relationships between freely contracting individuals. So up to a certain size, corporations have an advantage because they hide all that transaction cost economics. You just get a pool of labor, get a pool of talent, and then apply it to problems without having to constantly write new contracts. And then above a certain size, because inside a corporation, it's a planned economy, right? And we all know planned economies don't work very well, right? On the one hand, why don't you have a whole sea of freely contracting individuals? On the other side, why don't you just have megacorp? Why don't you have, Soviet Union was megacorp, wasn't it? That didn't work very well. So there's a dynamic tension there, and so sort of understanding what you do inside your organization and what you do through contracting, what you do through third parties, understanding what sorts of innovation can be supported in a contracting fashion, and what sorts of innovation really are best done inside the planned economy of a single corporation is an important. It's an interesting. I mean, just like with computer science, right? There is a body of professional knowledge, there's a body of theoretical practice associated with running a business, and it's really easy to disdain it, right? Because we have this kind of culture of the macho guy who started off, Alan Sugar kind of character, guy who started off running selling stuff on a stall, and ends up running a big corporation, right? And never did a day's executive ed in his life, and that's great. And there are savants like that out there, either lucky people or savants out there who will kind of walk that road. But for most of us, I think that's an expensive way. So I talked about the cost of an MBA, tens of thousands of pounds. An MBA is the cheap way to get business experience. The expensive way to get business experience is to start some companies, screw them up, learn the lessons. It might save you, that those MBA fees might save you and save a couple of companies the experience of being founded and screwed up.
You started like hacking when you were young. Then you went and like hardcore tech. You were designing chips, really technical, and then like your roles kind of changed over the years. Now you're more business focused.
Yeah, I'm extremely business focused now. I try to keep up with the people we have. We have an amazing workforce here. Obviously, the engineering workforce here is by far the highest average capability level that I've ever engaged with. And, I go out there and I have to try and help people understand what to do, think about what to do next. And that's kind of an intimidating environment. I try to stay current. I am not especially current. I live in fear of becoming less current. I'm still at a level of technical ability, a level of technical involvement where I can at least ask, at least half the questions aren't dumb, which is good. That's a good ratio. If I can keep the ratio above 50%, then you sort of still feel like you're hanging on by your fingernails to the edge of technical relevance. And it's a great bunch. It's a great bunch of people. I mean, it's a wonderful group of people. And of course, many of whom I've known for well over a decade now. It's a wonderful group of people to be doing innovation with.
Here's a nasty question, right? Do I need to go to university?
Oh, do you need to go to university? I don't think you need to go to university. I think there are some challenges. Our society's got itself into a bit of a hole in respect of whether you need to have a university degree. And there's a risk that what's happening to degrees is they're becoming badges of conformance and badges of conformity. And that what you're saying is, I was prepared. Here's a token. I was prepared to spend £50,000 to buy this token. And what that token tells you is that I conform. And what employers want, what a lot of employers want, is people who will. All employers. I mean, it's a respectable want for an employer to want employees who conform to certain standards of socialization. And the real risk is that all we've done is we've created this token. And if you don't have the token, then people think, oh, you must be a bit odd. Perhaps you're a bit odd. Do I really want to hire someone who's a bit odd? That's a really dangerous place for society to have got to. So I think there's enormous value in degrees. And I don't just think that there's value in degrees which are, my father was an English academic. I'm not one of these people who thinks that university is a training ground for employees, and that the only worthwhile degrees are the ones that couple directly into some transferable, commercial, employable skill. It's a horrible way of thinking about education. And so I think there is enormous value in it. And in the particular case of computer science, I think it has value in the sense of a little bit like the MBA thing. I once met a guy who was working for a graphics company in Finland. Now, Finns are amazing, a lot of amazing Finnish engineers. And this guy was working on a compiler for the GL shading language, a component of the OpenGL driver that we were going to license for the video call platform. And he had never been to university, amazing engineer. And he had written this compiler from scratch. And he had, through intellectual brute force, had invented, all of compiler technology all the way through to the mid-1970s, from scratch. He could have done a 6-week compiler course at university and not had to do that. And it would have got him to the state of the art in 2000, not the state of the art in 1975. So it's important, again, not to disdain the body of professional practice. And having respect for the body of professional knowledge can sit alongside having respect for and acknowledging the importance of practical endeavor as a way of kind of leavening that. If you want to go get a job in as an engineer in the computer industry, it's good to get a computer science degree at some point. It'll save you effort in the same way it will save someone who wants to start an MBA will save a business person some effort. But it's not to say you can't get there the other way. But I honestly think it's a harder road.
I love what you said. You're talking from experience. Like, you had some businesses. Some of them didn't go so well. Some of them went well. If you had done the MBA, it's like learning from people who've walked that road before you.
I certainly, in terms of, you sort of think about going back to university. So I did my first startup when I was a third year here at Cambridge. I dropped out of the fourth year of the engineering program to run that startup. I found a couple of things. One, like a lot of engineer-led startups, we had a big pile of paper in the corner of the room. The government would send us paperwork and we'd put it in the corner and ignore it. Or our bank would send us paperwork and we were, it was a successful business, but put it in the corner and ignore the pile of paper. And after a while, we were actually based at London Business School in London. And in the end, we basically ran out into the corridor and grabbed a passing MBA graduate by the collar and said, if you come in here and sort out that pile of paper, we'll give you some stock. And that certainly instilled in me a very great desire to go and get an MBA. So I didn't have to do that again. You kind of have these experiences running businesses which kind of make you alive to the stuff you don't know. And then, so that's the kind of business example for my first startup. The technical example is I didn't have a computer science degree. I had I'd done a lot of hacking, and I did a physics and engineering degree here at Cambridge. And I was recruiting people into that business. And I was just aware that they knew stuff that I didn't know, data structures and algorithms type stuff, compiler type stuff, digital electronics type stuff. And I was just aware that there was clearly a missing chunk of stuff that I needed. And that's why I went back and did the diploma here. That's why I came back and did the conversion course. That's what kind of drove me out of my first startup and back into academia.
I mean, this is a great place to work, or if I want to go and work for. No, so I think the name and from what I've seen is amazing. We do
fun stuff, right? I mean,
yeah, exactly.
And it's the deepest of deep tech. There's not much tech this deep in the UK.
Exactly.
There's a lot of that's not to disparage the fintech. There are people who are writing software, writing consumer-focused software, but there aren't many companies doing the super deep stuff here in the UK.
But how would I get here?
So what do we hire? They generally do have pretty good academics, but I wouldn't say that we hire, we're not particularly Cambridge snobs. We probably have, I would say we have as many people from York as we do from Cambridge. There are other universities in the UK compared to Cambridge, and Cambridge produces some amazing graduates. But if you think about that trade-off between practical and theoretical skills, there are other trade-off points, and there are, for our needs, there are the universities that hit those trade-off points in their courses a little better than Cambridge does. So when we're taking people from Cambridge, we're usually taking people who happen to have gone to Cambridge, but who were hobbyist programmers beforehand and who've got their hobbyist stamp, their craftsperson stamp somewhere else. So we take people with good academics, but doesn't necessarily have to be Oxbridge. We only really take people certainly into the hardware and software teams. We sometimes talk about, have you ever written a computer program you didn't have to write? One that you didn't have to do for your course, one that you didn't have to do for your employer. Did you ever build an electronic product or write a computer program you didn't have to write? So people who have demonstrated some kind of personal passion for this stuff. It's a pretty good discriminator, that, right? That really does discriminate very well.
Yeah.
And of course, one of the challenges is it over-discriminates a little bit, because what you're doing is you're discriminating against people who've lacked the opportunity to do that. And so to some extent what you're seeing with Raspberry Pi, it's a closed loop system, right? We kind of soup to nuts. You can see we're a foundation which is dedicated to giving every child the opportunity to discover that they like computing, and a venue in our hardware platforms and our educational resources, a venue in which they can work on that. And that then makes it more justifiable, will in due course make it more justifiable for us to operate this hiring policy, which could be seen otherwise as being being discriminating in the bad sense, not discriminating in the good sense.
I see it a lot in other fields as well, like technical fields. If you aren't prepared to put in your own effort and do your own thing, it's like, are you really is this really what you want to do?
Yeah.
And I mean, what you've got with the Raspberry Pis, I mean, obviously it doesn't apply to everyone, but for a lot of us, we have no excuse, because we've got a device that we can hack on or play on or do something with.
Yeah. And one of the wonderful things here is we now employ people, small number of people in their 20s who got their start on the Raspberry Pi.
That's great.
Right, so that closed loop system is now starting to establish itself, and we've got more work to do to make it, to keep it going, to make it happen. But we're on the road now, which is... And back to the idea that the computer industry, the workforce in the computer industry in 10, 20, 30 years' time is going to look a lot more like society than it does today. And that's going to be in part, I hope, because of the work that we've done with the foundation.
Eben, I really want to thank you, for taking so much time to talk to me. Just for everyone who's watching, we've done a lot today, and I really want to thank you for, taking all this time to share, but also to, encourage millions around the world to change their lives through what you've created, but also sharing your knowledge.
Thank you. I mean, it's weird, right? I've been working on this since 2006, right? This is it's getting on for a 20-year endeavor now. And the remarkable thing about it is it's still good fun. I'm an inveterate. Before we did this, I saw myself as an inveterate doer of things for 4 years. I thought that was my time period for working on anything was 4 years. This is coming up towards 20 now. So just wonderful to have a chance to chat about it. Thank you very much.
It's fantastic. And I mean, I just want to say thank you for changing lives through what you've created. I mean, I'm from South Africa. These kind of devices give people in places that are perhaps not as privileged the opportunities to change their lives. So thanks so much.
Awesome. Thank you.